Okay, today we're going to learn about working with stored procedures using SQL Server Management Studio, why they're important, and why they're valuable to us. So here I have SQL Server Management Studio launched, and I'm going to connect to my SQL Express instance on my local PC as our demonstration playground. On my environment, I have a sample database that's great for working with called the Northwind database that we've seen before and worked with before. The Northwind database, an older database, used to be distributed by Microsoft with SQL Server Management Studio, one that I like to always refer back to because it's a great place to start with fundamentals. It has data in the tables and structures. It has existing um, relationships, and everything that makes a great foundational database to learn the concepts with. Just kind of revert, I always like to start out with just a quick review of its database diagram to see what we're working with. And the database diagram here will show us it's an ordering system. And in the ordering system here, you can see the customers, suppliers, categories to the products, etc. So you can see quite a bit of information that's going to be in this database. Get that overview, get an understanding for it. Today we're going to work with stored procedures and understand why they're beneficial to us. With databases, typically you'll want to have applications created to interface with them and to work with them. When you write commands like we've seen previously with SQL statements, those have been set up for more of a one-time use, and they kind of get thrown away after you use them just at one time. But a lot of times we'll build things or do things that we'll want to use over and over again. And the only thing that really will differ is some of the criteria that's getting passed to the statement. Maybe the value in a where clause, for instance. One of the essentially what we'll call is a parameter. So a value that is something that tends to be dynamic, changes over time, and such. But the main part of the statement always is the same, and we want to have it in a reusable manner. When we do that with application development, stored procedures come in handy because it allows us to require a specific type of data type for that parameter, type of size in terms of number of characters, etc. So it helps us protect our applications from a security standpoint, in addition to some of the other benefits of a stored procedure. The reusability is a big part of that benefit. It separates our database components from our actual application as well. In addition to, it becomes compiled code on our server, so it's going to give us operational benefits of having it there. Now, out of the box with the Northwind database, you get some stored procedures, and you find them under programmability. And if you expand stored procedures, you'll see there's some ones here, in addition to potentially some ones that I've created over the years for demonstration purposes. And you'll encounter in different organizations different naming conventions of how they name their stored procedures. Naming conventions are important as always. In this case, some of the naming conventions, they'll give you an idea of what they do potentially, or their purpose potentially. Um, so you'll kind of see that, and if you read some of the names here, you'll get an idea. Well, this customer order history probably produces an order history of a customer. If we expand it, we'll also see what type of parameters it accepts. So in this case, it accepts a parameter for customer ID. The data type should match the customer ID of the customer table. So nchar5 is likely the same data type of the customer ID in the customer table, a start date and an end date. Okay, and it has an outcome returning of an integer. Basically, you figure out what the customer has ordered over a given period of time is what we'd expect this to do. So we could pass any customer ID to it, and we could pass any date range to it. And this code that would be found in this procedure would get reused. So we don't have to write it from scratch. So just to see how it executes, for instance, if we do a new query, okay, and we'll want to make sure our query is on the Northwind database. That's always a good checkpoint. If you're usually on that in your Object Explorer, then when you click New Query, you should automatically default into that instance as well. But occasionally you might have to check to make sure you're not in another database. The first thing I want to do real quick is just get a couple customer IDs to work with. So what I'll do is just a basic select statement, and you likely have encountered one or seen one in the past if you're looking at stored procedures. Hopefully you have. So I'm just going to do select star from customers right now, just to get some customer IDs that we can work with. So I get a whole bunch of them back. I get all of them back essentially. I'm just going to just basically grab 6 of them, 7 of them here, copy them, put them on my screen, and I'm just going to put comments in front of these, basically 2 dashes to comment all this out, just so I don't accidentally try to execute statements that wouldn't work. So I have some sample data to work with, okay? And now what I'm going to do is show you how you work with the stored procedure. Now there's a couple ways you can work with it. One way, you can actually right click on it and you can execute the stored procedure. Okay, when you right click and execute it, you're going to get the pop-up asking you to specify these parameter values. Okay, that is one way of doing it. And you can put the values here, click OK, and what it'll do is write a little script to your query window there and execute it. That's one way. Another way you can do it is simply type the stored procedure's name, and here it's kind of nice. You can click on it, drag the name over, okay, and drop it. You don't even have to type it. And then you just have to pass the parameters in order based upon what's necessary. So the easiest way to do it is pass your customer ID next. So we'll take this first one here, AHW12, paste it, and then put our start date. Let's say 01/01/1996. And the reason I'm going back this far in time is because the Northwind database is from about 20 years ago or so, maybe over 20 years ago now. And the data for the orders really occurred in 1996 and 1997, I believe. So I'll put in 96 through 98 as my range here. And what we'll do is figure out that that lines up to our parameter for our customer ID. This lines up for our parameter for start date. This lines up for our parameter for end date. So if I highlight these and execute it now, okay, I don't get any data back when I ran this procedure. So now I might have a bad date range potentially, okay? So maybe the customer that I chose hasn't placed any orders, or I have a date range that's not realistic for when the orders occurred. So there's a couple of different things that could have occurred there. I will take another customer ID and just see if I get any results for a different customer ID at random. And I get some data back. So I feel like I have the right date range from what this data has, and we can look at some different ways to look at how that confirm that. And it maybe just that one customer did not ever place an order. So we run this procedure. We get customer ID, company name, the order ID, and then the order date. Okay, it just basically tells us some basic information of this customer's orders. So perhaps they called into your call center and you search for them, and it comes back with the orders that they placed first. Okay, and maybe you need to get more information about a particular order, but this would be your starting point of seeing, this order ID 10501 was placed on April the 9th, 1997. But for you as someone executing a procedure or the application executing a procedure, it's a lot easier just to call customer order history and pass 3 parameters to it than if we had to take the time to write the code from scratch to do that. So typically in an environment where you work with developers that are maybe the application developers and the database developers can say, okay, here's your stored procedure, here's the parameters, and the database and the application developers don't need to understand how to write SQL. They just need to know how to call a procedure and pass parameters to it and make it very simple. Now, let's look at the SQL that happened to run when we called this procedure. If we right click our procedure and modify it, okay, we're going to see it. And when we modify it, one thing to note is modifying uses the data definition command of alter, all right, versus the data definition command of create. So alter means we're going to change something. If we're writing this for the very first time, we would write this with create procedure. But if we're changing it, we want to modify it in some way, shape, or form, we're going to make it alter. Now, we look at this, we'll see the first portion, the first line is going to be the create or the alter. It's going to be the name of the procedure. Okay, after that, the parameters it's taking in their data types. So we have three parameters here: customer ID, start date, and end date, and their data types, just like we saw over in our Object Explorer. After we've defined our data types, we use as, and then we have a begin and an end section. And inside of that begin or end is where our actual query is going to be. So what's occurring here is this select statement. It's selecting the customer ID, the company name, the order ID, the order date from the customers table, interjoining the orders table. So basically making a join based upon the relationship between customers and orders. And that's occurring on the customer ID field. You see that here and here. They also used an alias. They use an alias, so every time they want something from the customers table, they use cust. Every time they want something from the orders table, an alias of orders used, or ord is used. That allows for an abbreviated form. It makes it easier to create the queries and easier to read the queries instead of using the full table name. So since they've used the alias here on the from line, then that alias is going to be used on the select line, on the on line, and also on the where line. Now, when we get to the where clause, we're going to see where those parameters come into place. So the where clause, we are going to essentially say where the customer ID is equal to the one being passed into this procedure. Okay, and the order date is going to occur between the start date parameter and the end date parameter, and we want the results to be ordered by order date. Now, since we're here modifying it, right now by default, that's going to be order date from oldest to newest. Typically, if somebody's calling in to an environment, they're going to want to have the most recent first. So what I would typically do is do descending on something like this. And since we're here in alter form, I'm going to change that to use DESC so that we get the oldest to the newest. So make it in descending order, or I'm sorry, to newest to oldest, make it in descending order when this runs. Now, to change that around, we just will highlight all of this and we'll execute it, and that'll recompile this procedure with the changes into our database. So let's look at it real quick now before we do that. So when we ran it, we had order date of 97, 49, 417, 627, 729. Okay, so it was the oldest to the newest. Now, after I say, okay, I'd rather have the newest on the top. And the nice thing about this, if my application was returning it, like my web application or a desktop application, and we realized the sort was not how we liked it, we didn't have to go into the application to change any code and recompile it or redeploy it. We could actually make that change safely on the database. And since this is such a minor change, so if I execute this, what happens now is this new definition is saved to my database. So if I was to close it and modify it again, you're going to see it with my changes. Okay, but we're going to run this command now, and we're going to see if the order date flows the other direction. And the results show that now. We get the newest to the oldest. Okay, and I didn't do anything as far as the guy consuming the procedure or executing it. I had nothing to do. Right behind the scenes in the code of the procedure, that's where the change was made, and that that was transparent and separate from the actual user of the procedure, which makes it nice. Right? So that's how you use a procedure. That's how you modify one and review one. Now, let's say you want to build one from scratch. Okay, let's say we want to build a simple procedure that will give us some information about our products and the categories they belong to. Okay, let's just say we want some product details and some category details that exist. And if we look back at our database diagram, for instance, and take a look here, let's say we want a product ID, a product name, units in stock, and the actual category ID, the category name that it belongs to. Okay, and let's say we only want that based upon a category that we pass into our query. We'll make it really simple. Okay, so we want to see all products for maybe a category name of beverages, and that's one of the values in this database. So we'll start with a very simple procedure. All right, so the best way to do that would be to um, go and take the one that we had previously to use as a template for an idea. Okay, a lot of times I'll say is to bring it up, and you can do is you can script it as a create to a new query editor window. Okay, that's a good starting point. So a lot of times when we're building things, I like to take things that exist and use them as my template. So we could do a new query editor window and get it there and make that our modified case. So what I'll do is I'll do that and I'll have something to look at. But I'll also do is right click here and do stored procedure and let SQL Server develop a template for me and just look at how that comes out. So I'll tend to typically use the SQL Server template as a starting point for the first time I'm going to create a new procedure in my database, because I want to get some of the structure that I prefer for best practices down, as opposed to what might have already been there. Like in the one that we are going to borrow from, there is not any programming definitions at the top. There's no good header information from a best practice standpoint. And in the template, you'll see the template is up here, has some areas for declarations or documentations about the author and everything. So I would suggest that we utilize that type of format from a good practice and a purpose, so that others who come in, they can keep a change log, a modification history, and understand what this purpose was for. So what I'll do with the template typically is remove the top comment section. Here in the author section, I'll fill this out, right? I'll put in, my name, okay? The creation date here, what I'll put in is, the creation date that I'm going to work with. And let's say I'm working with August 25th, 2025. And this is going to basically return a list of products based on a category name entered. Okay, so that's what this procedure is going to do. All right, and now I have to come up with a procedure name. Okay, sometimes these templates get a little confusing because they put in default parameters and such. And once you're familiar with them, it'll make sense to you. So essentially, here is where you want to put your procedure name. Okay, so here I'm going to call this products by category name. Okay, so what this is going to tell me is I got to actually know a category name to put in. So long as I know a category name to put in, I'll be able to use this procedure. The other piece of this is I'm using camel casing, not using spaces. You'll see some bad practices in other databases where they utilize spaces and such, special characters. You want to be very cautious with. You can work with spaces in SQL Server. I avoid them. Camel casing makes it easier. If you really want to have some separation between words, underscores work as well. But you might want to consult with your environment to see what their practices are currently and follow their conventions, or other developers on your team. If you don't have other developers, or if you see things haven't been done like in a standard manner, I would suggest and recommend that you create a standard manner and then and then socialize that if you're on a team, and get adoption for it. That way things become easier to read and understand across the team. Like perhaps you might want to say this is going to be a get, and we'll call it get products by category name. Okay, you'll see a little bit of that variation over here in my samples from different demonstrations and what's come out of the box with this database and stuff. So I'll leave it up to you guys in terms of how you want to determine your names, but it's something that you should consider from a standard and a best practice scenario. So this is going to have a simple parameter, okay, and the parameter here is going to be category name. Okay, and the data type for category name, what I recommend is you match it to the actual table. So if we look at the categories table, expanded over here, category name is nvarchar 15. Okay, so we would do nvarchar 15. Right? That's going to be our only parameter. So we're going to get rid of the comma, and we're going to get rid of any other lines in the template that have parameters. We'll clean this up a little bit, as I'll do some additional indenting, and I'll clean up the comments and such that they give me, and I'll just keep the begin and the end here. Okay, so now I have the structure. Now I have to write the query. I know that I'm going to want some fields from my products table, and if I look at the products table here, let's look at the columns. Let's say I want to get, we'll start with the select statement. I want to get the product ID, the product name, the quantity, per unit, the unit price, the unit in stock, units on order. That's all I really care about for this query. So this is going to come from the products table. We're going to join it with an inner join, categories, and I'm going to use those aliases the same way. So I'm going to call products prod, categories cat, and I'm going to do an inner join on prod.category ID equals cat.category ID. Okay, so we have our join condition. Now we have that information. I'm going to also bring back the actual category name. Okay, and as well. And my where clause is going to be where category name equals the parameter that we came up with at category name. Okay, that's me my where clause. And what I'm going to do is also do and discontinued equals 0. I don't want any products that are discontinued. I don't want them coming back. And I'm going to order by product name. All right. So this should tell me with this join, I should bring my products and my categories together. And this join should bring me results back based upon a category name I put in. All right, so I got, like I said, a little declaration section. I got my procedure creation statement. I got the parameter it's going to take. I'm going to remove this comment from the template. I don't need it. I might put another comment in here if I felt like I had any advanced programming or anything in my section, but this is a very simple statement. I might make a note, join products and categories on category ID, and only get current products. Okay, so I'm going to highlight that and execute it. And if I did it correctly, it'll do a command completed successfully. And then if I go back to my Object Explorer and right-click on Stored Procedures, what we'll see here is my Get Products by Category Name. Okay, and we'll look very closely for that, and you'll see it Get Products by Category Name. Okay, so let's test that one out. I'll do another new query, and here first I'll select star from categories. I'm just going to get the category names real quick. Okay. So I have a bunch of category names. I'm just going to grab some of them, just like we did with the customers, and we're going to see if we have products in any of these categories. Okay. So what we'll do is comment these out just so they're handy for test data. And we'll take our procedure, get categories by category name. We'll expand that to verify the data type and parameters. Okay. And varchar 15, it's an input parameter. It's called category name. And what we'll do is grab one of these categories names, and since they're a character based, I'm putting quotation marks around that parameter name. Okay. So all I have to do is execute it. And those are my current beverages. You'll see category name comes back. These are my product IDs, the product names. These are my units currently, my unit price, units on order. So it brings back the data I'm looking for. Again, as the consumer of the procedure, it was very transparent to me. I just had to know that this existed, right? And all I had to do was pass the right parameter value to it, and I get my results. Now, stored procedures don't have to be select statements. They can be insert statements, they could be update statements, they can be delete statements, whatever is necessary. You can have some very complex stored procedures with lots of programming logic in them. And again, the whole goal is not to put that logic in your application. You leave it on your database. It makes your data application more secure because your application can only then communicate to the database sending strict parameters based upon size and data type, preventing things like SQL injection, which you'll hear talked about whenever you have a database and an application together. You should be aware of it. And it'll also make things run more efficient from a performance standpoint because you're working with code that's been compiled. So each time the command is sent to the database doesn't have to check the syntax. Even though it happens pretty quickly and behind the scenes, it doesn't have to do that because it knows that that procedure compiled properly. So as long as you're sending parameters of the correct data type and size in the correct order, you'll get the results back. Okay. If you want to see what it's like if you right click on one and actually execute one, just a little bit different just to see how it comes up, I can put my value here of beverages, okay, and hit OK. Or let's do produce in this case because we just did beverages. Let's do produce. Okay. So when SQL writes the code for you and you hit OK, you'll get a few extra things. All right. You'll get a statement that's kind of a statement block with you're executing this procedure name, you're passing in that parameter, and it actually tells you the parameter name. And then it selects that return value that comes out. Now, I didn't create the procedure to actually have a return value, so it's going to return 0 in that case. But you saw that in the parameters, okay, to bring back the return value. Sometimes you'll create procedures with a return value. 1 if it's successful or 0 if it fails. Those types of scenarios you'll create potentially if you have inserts or updates or deletes that don't return a record set. When you return a set of records, you don't so much need the return value because it's likely you're going to take that record set and display it in your application. But if you do a command like an update, an insert, or delete, you want to know if it succeeds or fails. So that return value could be important to you. Okay. So this is just an overview or a high-level use and view of working with stored procedures, just to get your feet wet, to see they're useful, to see their value. From here, I recommend you try it out, come up with some ideas of things that you might want to do repetitively. Try out building one, and then if you have any questions or need any assistance with them, share your code with me. I'll be more than happy to help answer any questions or help you solve any error messages that you might encounter. So I hope you found this valuable, and are able to make use of stored procedures now. Thank you.